I was born in Youghal a long time ago. You might say my father kept his tongue ticking. Living in the Clockade was an honour, but was tough. Life is so different from the way things are today. Well, I was born in the Clockade, famous building in Youghal. I was born there in 1939. We were caretakers there. My grandfather first took up the duties there in 1915. My grandfather was married twice. His wife from his first marriage died in childbirth. He met my grandmother then. He came to work in Youghal in the construction of the metal bridge between County Waterford and County Cork. He came from a place called Trionóide, which is just over the bridge. This is my father here. Now, a lot of these emigrated and went to America, Scotland and Australia. My father stayed in the Clockade and he married this lady here, is Agnes Leahy, and she came from Timoleague in West Cork. And they got married in Timoleague in 1933. And they had 4 of a family. This is my eldest sister Nancy, who was an invalid. This is my sister Sheila, my brother David, and myself. Now, there is only myself and my sister left. My sister and my brother had passed on. So we lived in the Clockade, and my father done the duties that his father had done before him in winding the clock and being a caretaker here. And we lived here then in the Clockade until 1959, the very end of 1959. It could be nearly 1960. Now, to describe exactly what the clock was like, if you could visualize a grandfather clock, and it has a pendulum and 2 weights, and every so often you've got to wind these weights up to keep the clock going. One weight is for the mechanism and the other one is for the bell or the chimes. And that was the type of system they had in the Clockade. Now that had to be done twice a week. It was quite a difficult job. I can't remember exactly how long, but it certainly would have taken 45 minutes. The sound of the bell, would you believe it, we became accustomed to it, that we never heard it. But what stands out in my memory is that on the very first floor, we're talking now about 4 stories down, at 12 o'clock at night, when there wouldn't be a sound, there was very little traffic around, I could actually hear the pendulum. You could hear it going tick, tock. And the pendulum used to swing about 6 feet an hour. It would go 3 feet one way and 3 feet the other way. It was absolutely huge. And then that brings back memories. When the clock was about to strike, you'd always know it, because for a few seconds, maybe half a minute beforehand, you'd hear the ropes and they started cracking and stretching, and then the bell would start. And that bell was also used to call out the fire brigade. The rope ran from the mechanism of the clock, where the bell was, all the ways down to our living accommodation, the first floor. So when there was a fire in town, there would be somebody come to the door, and whether it be morning, noon or night, knock us up and tell us that there was a fire. Now where it wasn't any of our business really. Our duties were to ring this bell, and this bell would be kept going until such time as the fire brigade left its fire station, which is down on the Market Square. The other tragedy that we would have to ring the bell for, there was a big fishing community here. I suppose there could have been 20 or 30 families relying on fishing. Salmon was a great thing here. There would be 4 of a crew in every salmon yard, and they didn't have outboard engines or anything like that, so they'd row away out to the mouth of the harbour, cast out their nets, and they could be there all night. And the clockade was something that they always listened for, because the sound of the bell, I don't think they had any watches, and they'd listen for, they'd always know what time of the night it was. And if there was a tragedy that maybe one of them was drowned or something like that, the alarm bell would have been used here for that as well. I suppose the thing that's outstanding about my mother was that she was very, very religious and brought her religion to the family. So it was very, very important that we knelt around after the tea at night to say the rosary. It wasn't something that as a young fella you were anxious to do, because all we wanted to do was get out and play. I had a sister then, the eldest girl, Nancy McGrath, and she was an invalid. There was some complication during birth. I'm not quite sure what it was, but her arms and legs were affected, but her brain was perfect. She was very, very clever. I suppose she was so clever that her and I didn't get on too well. It was a chore to take my sister up and down the stairs and the steps to the clock gate. Very, very difficult. And then it depended on the elements. If it was raining, then she couldn't be brought out. In 1948, I had an aunt in Boston, and she knew the difficulties with my sister, and she sent a wheelchair from America. And I would say that it was probably the first wheelchair to arrive in Youghal. I remember when it came in from, at that time, the railway would come to town, and there was a railway horse and carriage, and they would deliver the goods round town. And this crate came to the clock gate, and my father and myself tumbled it up the steps, brought it into the living area at the clock gate, and opened it up and put this wheelchair together. People were stopping downtown to have a look at this thing. It gave her a new lease of life. One of her favourite outings would have been to go to the cinema, as we called it at that time, the pictures. The pictures were very, very important to the community, because it was an escape from the reality of living in poverty. When you went to the pictures, you saw this another way of life. It was absolutely terrific. And if it was a cowboy film and Indians and things like that, when you left after a couple of hours in the pictures, you thought you were a horse and you were the cowboy. But my sister had a a big grow for the likes of Bing Crosby and Mario Lanza and that type of stuff, you know. The musicals were a very, very big hit at the time. And that was a great escape from it. In the height of the winter, on a gale force 10, the four walls here, you could actually hear the wind whistling around it. And if the rain fell, the roof was in such bad condition that the water would drip down from floor to floor. And if it came to the quarter where we were sleeping, we'd have to probably get out, move the bed, put a couple of buckets to collect the water, and the following morning the buckets would be so full that I can tell you it wasn't easy to bring them downstairs, so we'd open the window and throw the water out. It didn't matter, there wasn't a lot of traffic around or a lot of people to get soaked with water anyway. But the conditions were appalling. Well, as you know, there are 4 stories, and there was 2 rooms or 2 cells in every story. The first floor would have been our living accommodation, where we had our meals and done usual chores. There was the room next to that would have been an outside kitchen, as we called it. Everybody had ration books, and eggs were very scarce, and we never saw fruit or anything like that. Most of our cooking was fish and would you believe pig's trotters? They were known as crew beans. One of the systems of cooking meals was a device called a sawdust drum. So what we done was we made a hole in the bottom of the biscuit tin. We got the handle of a broom and we stuck it into it. Then we got sawdust and we packed it in around the handle. We put this biscuit tin up on 2 bricks, removed the broom handle. Then we got the cover of a polished tin, and we put some sawdust into it, and maybe a bit of methylated spirits or paraffin oil, ignited that and pushed it in between the 2 bricks. And the hole that the hand of the broom had left an area for the flames to ignite. When that started to light, we had a grid then to put on top. My mother then would have a stew such as meat, vegetables, and that was put on the top of that, and that was cooking all day long. It was a slow cooker many, many years before its time. That was one system we had. The other one we had was, we had town gas, but by the time I had reached 5 or 6 years of age, town gas had gone. So we had to have a paraffin oil cooker. The conditions then as regards heating, there wasn't any. Only we had a fireplace, and that used to burn coal, and we used to sit around that. I suppose that your legs and your feet and your hands were warm, but your back was frozen. We'd have what they call in the morning for our breakfast, goodie. And what was goodie? It was very difficult to keep bread fresh, not like today. You had a fridge to put it into. So the bread would be lying out overnight and it would be as hard as a rock. So my mother would make the tea in the morning, put the milk in, and then the bread would be broke up and put into it, and that was a goodie. There was times when we could have porridge, not very often. So things were pretty nasty and pretty grim. On the next floor then, there were 2 bedrooms. Now you must remember that the conditions in the Clockade hadn't changed a whole lot from what it had been for many, many, many years before that. It was nearly like the conditions that the prisoners lived in, because the bars were still on the windows. The only difference was that there was windows there with glass. When the prisoners were there, it was shutters that kept out the elements. My mother and father slept on one room with my 2 sisters, and on the room opposite that then, my brother and myself. That's the second story. On the third story then, there was the fuel room, the sawdust, as I explained about the sawdust drum. That was where we gathered sawdust during the summertime and left it into this room to keep it as dry as possible. The room opposite that, we called it the trunk room. And why we called it the trunk room was that my aunts used to send clothing home from America, and all the children in America had long pantses. But here in Ireland, we never had long pants, we were short pantses. So we got lots of these long pants, and my brother and myself wouldn't wear them. So my mother had to cut off the legs and off them and alter them so that we would wear them. Now, that room, during the summertime, that had another function. When the mackerel season came in here, the fish were very, very plentiful, say about August, September. And I would go to the quayside and catch as many mackerel as I possibly could, dozens of them. My father would come along and bone them, clean them, and salt them. And then they were taken up to the trunk room. And we put lines across the room, and they were pegged along the line. So they were salted for the winter time. When my mother would go to get them in the winter time, it was like shoe leather. But anyway, that's what we eat. And it was quite healthy, that food. Now, on the fourth story, we didn't have a yard for my mother to wash the clothes and hang out to dry. So my father removed the windows from the north side and the south side, and we strung these lines across the room. My mother could hang up the clothing, and the wind could blow in and out. So it didn't matter whether it rained or not. The room opposite that then was a room that I had taken up. I used to keep pigeons, and a lot of the pigeon fanciers in Youghal envied my position because I was the highest loft in town. There was no problem with the birds seeing where their home was. Then, of course, after that, it was the parapet. Now, when during the summertime, when I'd gathered the sawdust, it was a chore to go to where the sawmills were. And the gentleman that was in charge of the saw would see me coming with a makeshift pram and an empty bag. And he would turn off the saw. He would go for smoke his pipe. I would go in underneath the saw and scoop as much sawdust into it as I possibly could and fill it up. he was a lovely gentleman, because he would come along then, and it didn't dawn on me at the time how generous he was, but he would tie the bag up, then put it on the pram, and I would wheel it down as far as the Clock Gate, maybe about 200 yards. At that time, a lot of the lads that I went to school with would be playing marbles on the streets or other conkers or something like that. But when they'd see me coming along, they'd all come along to know, can they help out with bringing the sawdust up to the sawdust room, 3 stories up. They didn't really want to help me, they wanted to see what the inside the Clock Gate was. So of course I left them do it. And when we do this chore, then we'd go a little bit further up onto the parapet and shout at the locals downtown. It was something that my mother and my grandmother were very annoyed about, because you can imagine, and hopefully you'll get an opportunity to see, it is a highly dangerous place. But we would dare each other to crawl along the walls and things like that, and pushing and shoving, and I suppose things that young people do to each other. Did I love it? Not really, because I envied a lot of boys that had a back garden to play with. They could kick football and things like that, and have a bit of fun in their back garden. I didn't have that. And I was restricted by my parents from going to the top. So from that aspect of it, I always felt that I knew it was a jail, and I often wondered, did my school buddies think, I'd hate to be living in that place, Living near the sea, we used to go down around the docks when the tide was out, and we had what they call a gaff. It was the handle of a brush, maybe about 3 feet long, and in the end of it, it had a gaff, a hook, and we'd crawl along the walls as the tide was gone out, and look into the holes, and you could see what there was, conger eels. And these conger eels, they could vary from size from a foot to anything up to 4 feet long. And you'd see them, that the eyes peeking out at you, and you'd stick in the gaff, turn it inside, and then whip it, and you'd catch them under the chin, and you'd pull it out, and this is like a snake, and there'd be 2 or 3 of us there battling with the snake, and they were bouncing around the place, and after a while we'd kill it, and then we'd cut it up, make small pieces out of it, and feed it to the seagulls, and that was a lot of fun. The other thing that we used to do, I suppose, the farmers and the people that used to have orchards with apples on it, they hated come the end of August, because the boys from the towns used to go out into the country places and grab the apples and make their way home. But of course there was a reason for that too. Apple tarts were very sought after. And of course then there was blackberries to be gathered, and there was a shop down not too far away from the Clock Gate here. Carl's shop was his name, and he used to make blackberry jam and all that type of thing, and we'd supply him with the blackberries and apples and things like that. In return, we were given a few pence, and that was our admission into the cinema or the pictures as we knew it, and our escape from reality into a make-believe world. But those were very, very exciting times, and we loved that. Our day was full every day. I suppose the farthest thing from our mind was our reading and writing and things like that. At that time, we were being taught by the Christian brothers. They were a law unto themselves. That was an experience that a lot of boys in my class and my time would have gone through, with the result that a lot of boys failed to go to school. And if you failed to go to school, then at that time you were shifted off to an industrial school, and you spent up to 16 years of age, we'll say from the age of 10, 11 years of age. And you know what happened. They had tribunals about all this brutality went on in industrial schools. I left school when I was 13 and a half years of age. And the first job that I got was a messenger boy. And that was not unusual, because most of the boys at that time, that was the first job they took up, delivering messages, butchers, fish, groceries, everything and anything. So I was there until I was 14 years of age. And then at 14 years of age, there was a textile factory here. And the textile factory was Seafield Fabrics. It had about 250 employees. I started there, and I remember my job was to pick up papers and things on the mill. The first year was a very, very happy time, and I was able to provide my mother with extra money. My father worked for the councillor at a very, very low wage as well. My sister couldn't work, so I was the next breadwinner. And that would have been 1953 I started. And in 1954 then Moby Dick film came to the own. And I was fortunate living in the Clock 8 in as much as that there was a scene to be made in Spouters Inn, and I could look down at it. Now the majority of the people were cordoned off by ropes and the Gardaí and their own security people to make sure that the public weren't going to encroach in the filming of. But I remember one particular scene. I think that it could have been one gentleman was to go into Spouters Inn, and they had a huge fan, and they had the local fire brigade with a hose, and that made the effect as if there was a huge storm there, and the floodlighting. And in order to get this right, then they didn't put the film star through the first set. They had a few extras, so they put one fella through first, and whatever mistake he made, they told the film star, you know, this is that, so he'd have to go through again. And then there was another fella made, and eventually after 5 or 6 times, the film star himself, he was allowed to do the thing. And I was fascinated at the idea that it was taking so long to make one scene. I'm talking maybe there could be 2 hours, and it didn't matter about the daylight or the nighttime or anything like that, because they had these huge lights. The filming of Moby Dick brought an awful lot of people to the town. Lots of people then got jobs as extras and walking up and down the street. And they were well paid, I think, at the time. It could have been, they could probably get a week's wages for one day. I was fortunate enough that when the filming was made, I could view it from the top of the clock gate. I had a bird's eye view of everything that was happening. But my mother used to help out in the catering. And of course my sister was very interested in the filming as well. My mother got an autograph book then, and she had close contact with the people that were making the film, like John Huston, Gregory Peck and all those. And she got the autograph book and got it signed. When we moved to Catherine Street in 59 and 60, that was something that was treasured. And then when my parents passed on and my sister passed on, and the house went to another family. In the early 60s I worked for Youghal Carpets, and I was having a pint in a bar one night when this gentleman came in, George Welsh, and he said, we were up in your attic in your old house, he said, and we came across an autograph book. He said, I'm not sure whether this belonged to you or not. And I said, well, we did have an autograph book, but I said, I don't know whatever happened to it. So he went back to number 1 Catherine Street and appeared and showed me this autograph book. And I said, gee, I said, George, I said, how am I going to thank you so much? I said, a lot of people would just keep it and not. And I'm very grateful to him and to have this book since 1954, that it'll always have a special place in my house. I was promoted then in my job in the factory, and to be honest about it, at 15 years of age, I wasn't able for it. And I suppose I rebelled, and I was dismissed. And I was at a very upset time of my life. I was sorry that I had left my job and left my mother without wages and things. I got another job then, and it was not as well paid as Seafield Fabrics, the textile company. I was very unhappy there, and I remember I was about 17 and a half years of age, and 2 of my friends had decided they were going to London. So when I got my week's wages anyway, I took off, and I had an address of an aunt of mine in Scotland, and I decided, well, I might never use it, but just in case. We went, at that time, there was a boat leaving Cork regularly, twice a week, I think, the Innisfallen. The boys anyway decided that maybe they should go to London. And well, there wasn't much room for me for 3 fellows in London, so I decided that maybe I'd go to Scotland. I remember I was very, very lonely there. I would write a letter back to my mother, and as I was leaning over the table, the tears would be wetting the writing paper that I was writing on. But I got a job in a brickworks, and the brickworks was very, very difficult. I was only a slim, just over 17 years of age, and the work was very difficult. And the people that worked in the brickwork, it was a place that they were always looking for workers. It was a dirty, hard, terrible place. And the people that were employed there most of them were ex-prisoners from a prison in Glasgow called Berlini. And these fellows, they were exceptionally good to me. I stuck it on, it was all night work. I stuck that job for a few months. And I was passing by the railway station, and I went in and asked the station master, would there be any work? And he said, we're looking for a porter. I was deemed eligible for employment. So when I took up my duties as a porter in the British Railways, the station master said, what age are you? And I said, I'm 21. And the reason I said I was 21 is because you wouldn't qualify for a man's wages unless you were 21. But that job was absolutely terrific. And then one day the station master called me and he said, I'm putting your name forward, he said, for a promotion to Edinburgh. But he says, you're going to have to get your birth certificate. And I had told him that during the war the records were destroyed with the bombs and things in Ireland. And I knew that I wouldn't get away with it much longer. So I had a cardboard suitcase and I packed it and came back to Ireland. And when I came back and stood in the clockade and I could see the misery and the poverty, I hadn't noticed it before then, but having seen another way of life and the comforts of home that they had in Scotland, I said to my mother, I said, we can't continue living in this building. So she said she knew that it wasn't the nicest place to be living in. But she said, what about your sister? Because her whole world was sitting in the window at the clock 8, where she could look down on the street. And at that time, the centre of town was a hive of activity. People in and out of shops in the morning. And they would always wave up to the window to my sister and come up and have a cup of tea and talk about the local gossip. And that was her life, you know, she loved it. And there was a possibility then that I was taking this away. But I had to think about my mother, and as time went on, she was getting old, how were we going to get my sister up and down the stairs and the steps. I went to see the town clerk and told him the story. And there was a house became vacant in the north end of the town. And we went to live there. And that would have been the end of 1959. And I can tell you, you know, the comforts of home with having a bath and electricity in every room, and it was heaven. My sister, I don't think she ever forgave me for what I'd done. Because when you lived in a back street, you're out of sight and you're out of mind. And by that time, my sister had been in extreme pain, and she became addicted to a tablet. It was called codeine. And it was supplied by the chemist by the bottle. I remember my family we'd go and visit my sister and my mother, and she'd be out of tablets. So it was only a matter of go up to the chemist and get a bottle of tablets. Eventually she became addicted to the tablets. It was very, very tragic. And I don't think anybody realised what being addicted to tablets was at that time. She was in actual fact, I suppose, a drug addict, and she didn't know it, and we didn't know it either. But that was a tragic time in my sister's life and my mother and father's time. It was something that I'm telling you the story now, but maybe it's a time I should forget about. So, to go back to the Clockade, when I drive under it, it was just another building. But then when the local authorities decided that they were going to renovate the Clockade, and there was a lady came from West Cork, Anne Scroop was her name, she was commissioned to do the work. And when she asked me if I could remember my time at the Clockade, it brought back so many memories. You must remember that when we left the Clockade in 1959, the building was derelict. And when Anne Scroop asked me if I could remember, I said, I know every inch of it. It's something I could never forget. So she said, it will be very necessary, she said, to make a model of what the Clockade. We can't put it back as it was because we want to use the different stories for different times in the history of the Clockade. So I said, I remember everything anyway. So along with that, on the third floor, they wanted to put a replica of what the clock was originally like at the Clockade. And my wife is very good on the computer, and Anne's group sent a website that we could look up in England as to different clocks and towers and belfries and so forth. There must have been 300 or 400. So we went through them, and we got on one that was, we thought, the nearest thing to it. So they arranged to get a clock from England. I think it was maybe 300 or 400 years old. They must have spent a lot of money on it. But then I had to describe to them how the mechanism worked, how the pendulum came down to the first floor, how the clock was wound, how the alarm bell worked, you know. And in the room, the third floor, where the clock is now, they have it all around the wall, exactly how the clock was wound. And there was a great sense of, God, I was contributing something to the town and to my family, and something that would be there for the rest of, and people would learn about the history of the Clockade. So it gave me a new idea, a new insight. And when I pass under the Clockade now, it sends a tingle through my body, you know. The minute I step into the McGrath Quarter, everything in my youth comes flooding back to me. And there are certain times when I reminisce and think about my sister and think about my family and what our life was like then. And sometimes I sit at the table and I would say a few prayers. I hope that the people in Youghal and people in Ireland generally will look at this building and say there was a lot of hardship there, but there was also a lot of lovely life, lovely time, happiness, real family life. I was born in Youghal a long, long time ago. You might say my father kept his tongue kicking. Living in the Clockade was an honour, but it was tough. Life is so different from the way things are today.
I was born